The focus of today's session is on how to improve the perceived high failure rate of M&A in our industry. And Greg Savage is joining us. He was on our inaugural podcast in June of 2022. It was a really popular podcast. I was super keen to get you back, Greg. What have you been up to over the last 18 months since we last talked?
Well, Simon, first of all, it's good to see you again, and thanks for inviting me back. Amazing to think it's 15 months or more since we last spoke. It's been a busy year for me. I am ostensibly meant to be winding back. Hopefully my wife can't hear this conversation in the background because she's pro that. But it's been busy because my main focus has still been on my advisory roles. Simon, as you remember, I'm on the board. Well, I was a year ago on the board of 16 recruitment companies. So it's now whittled down to 12. But that's actually the source of most of my insights, to be honest with you. I've got a lot of experience, and that goes back 40 years or more. But in terms of what's happening in the market now, it's sitting around the table with people who are doing it. So that's been big because, as you would know, there's been a change in market conditions from that frenetic and unexpected boom after COVID, where it was just suddenly higher. It's now pulled back. People are experiencing universally, pretty much, except in some niche areas like healthcare and others, a fall off in demand and change of clients' attitude around criteria for hiring, and also confidence of employees has changed a bit too. In Australia, interest rates are going up. We keep on hearing about recessions. There's this appalling evolution of wars around the world. And so it's taking some navigating and planning. I'm trying to help people not overcompensate, because what often happens, and you would have seen this, company has a great 3 or 4 years, they grow to 20 people, gross profit declines, they panic. Next minute, they're down to 6, and it takes them 5 years to get back. So we want to be careful about not overshooting the mark, but also we can't maintain the same costs and expenses when our revenues are dropping. So that's been. Do you want to talk about that before I go on?
No, I think what I'd like to do is just jump straight into this big question, and want to get your views on it. This statement that there is this perception that M&As in our industry have failed, or I should say, in some cases, or maybe in all cases, not met any of the desired outcomes. Like, what is your view on that? Is that a fair statement that the majority fail?
Yeah, I'm going to give you my view on that just after I've given you my view on the fact that South Africa just won the Rugby World Cup, because I really don't want you to skip over that, because I was there. I was at that game. And I just want to point out that that's 4 times in a row. Now, let's move on. Not in a row, but 4 times. I gave a talk recently on M&A, and I started with a slide, and I've taken the words from that slide, and it's going to answer your question. The first words I said were, "It's a brutal truth. Most transactions disappoint all parties." And that is my belief, based on zero surveying, but I'm being involved in many acquisitions and mergers, both from a selling point of view and a buying point of view and an advising point of view. Now, there's varying degrees of failure, Simon. There's some are totally catastrophic, and I've got some examples. Others are just mildly irritating, cost time, money, and are distractions. It's also true to say, I think, that if it's going to be bad, it's bad for all stakeholders. And by that, I mean the buyer, the seller, the consultants on both sides, the staff on both sides, and customers as well. But it can be okay for one party and bad for the others. I just came back from a speaking tour around the UK where I was launching my new book. If you thought there was going to be no adverts on here, you've got no chance, Simon. 1,000 recruiters turned up to those talks. And one of the people introducing me happened to just say, "I sold my business 3 weeks before COVID hit. It was such a brilliant experience for me. It was the luckiest thing of all time. I went out and bought a lotto ticket." And I couldn't help thinking to myself, but the person on the other side would have been a disaster. So it can be sometimes good for one party and not for other. But an example of a disastrous one that I'll talk to you about. This is an Australian company. It goes back a while. It's public knowledge, but I'm not going to mention people's names right now, because why would you? Okay. They went to the UK and they were expanding. They've done well in Australia and Asia. And I went to the UK and they bought a business. They paid $30 million, Simon, for this business. It was all permanent revenue, not a contractor in sight. Now, that's worrying, but the timing was this January 2008. Now, you would remember, because you're a very elderly fellow like me, that we were about to go into that Lehman Brothers, what we in this country call the GFC, the last big recession we had, financial crisis. And that business that they bought never made a profit for 5 years. Their staff dropped from 60 when they bought it to 10. And to compound the misery, the seller, he was on a 2 or 3 year restraint, which he stuck to. And as soon as it was over, the market started to pick up and he competed with the business that he sold. So it was diabolical. And now when you look at that, you say, well, what could they have done differently? We didn't know a recession was coming, and we didn't, that's true. That's true. But I think buying an all permanent business for that amount of money is setting yourself up for some pain. And the other one that just occurred, and this time I will mention it because it was in the press just the other day. And by the way, I'm not glorifying in anyone else's difficulties, Simon, because I have some significant and royal screw-ups of my own, which I'll talk about. But Ashley Services, or a company in this country, they acquired Link Personnel recently, in July last year, actually.
Okay.
$4.2 million they paid. Now, that value was written down last week to zero because of the loss of a key client in Link Personnel. Turns out that key client was a government body, and it generated all the company's profits. And I have to ask myself, and I'm not pointing the finger, really am not, because take no joy in other people's struggles, having had know what it's like running a business. But there must have been some due diligence failure there, because if you pay that much money when there's one client that gives you all the income, and that client was able to exit a year later, it's worrying. So those are big deals that go wrong. I had one myself. I was running a company called Aquint for 10 years. It's a global American company. I was the international CEO, which, if you work for an American company, means you run our businesses outside America, which I did. And we were doing real well in Australia. And in Melbourne, we were doing great. And I thought I had this rather clever idea of buying out our major competitor. And negotiations were done. I think a reasonable price was paid. A lot of it was temp and contracts. So I thought I'd got everything right. I thought we had worked hard for their senior people to come into our management group. Some had been promoted. But on the day, I'm not kidding you, on the day that the seller, who had left by now, the individual, on the day that her restraint was up, all 4 senior leadership resigned and joined her. So, okay, you could, if you're feeling sorry for yourself, you could say, well, you were duped and people shouldn't behave like that. But, I'm sure I did things wrong too. But that we really didn't get the value from that long term because of that. And I'll just sum this up by saying that there have been some magnificent deals that I've been involved in, where one, and what you've got to do with a merger, an acquisition, whatever you'd like to call it, is you've got one and you've got one, which normally equals 2. Where it works is where that equals 3, right? Where it's not just bolting on revenue, but there's synergies and sales ability. And I've had a few, and I'm much better now at working out how to make that work. But mostly, to pick up your question, they fail or they underperform, and sometimes it's because the target is wrong. Sometimes the buyer post-purchase leadership and decision-making is disastrous. And in many cases, these problems can be avoided or mitigated, which I'm sure we'll speak about.
Let me pick up on a few things that you said there. You mentioned that you talked about this business in the UK that was acquired in January of 2008, which is interesting for me because we sold our business I started in Japan, December the 26th, Boxing Day 2007, to Recruit Holdings. So I know all about that. And we stepped into Lehman Shock and we had aggressive earnouts and targets and all of the rest of it. No one was making much money in those years. But Recruit stuck with us, and I think we had a really solid post-merge integration plan. That business now is sort of 15 years later is 5x what it was in terms of revenue. It worked out really well. You talked about client concentrate. I mean, obviously the concentration risk of having one client in the government sector, or the major client, is just, it's a colossal buyer risk. And so it baffles me why that wasn't figured into the equation. And then you talked about the Aquin deal that you were involved in, where, you know, a number of the key people left and joined the founder. That's obviously something that we need to prevent. I know in my case, when I sold the business, there were 6 key men, if you like, and Recruit were very, very keen to make sure, you know, financially and in terms of career progression, that these people hung around for at least 6 to 12 months, as well as the founders, to help through the transition period. And we made sure that happened. So some really interesting points there. But I want to really drill down now on 2 things. One is pre-merger, one is post-merger integration. So pre-merger, when we're doing the due diligence, and when a buyer's looking at a business, what are the things that we can do to try to mitigate the risk of failure down the way? What are the key things?
Well, I'm going to address that, but to address that, we should dig a little bit deeper into the key reasons they go wrong. I touched on a few, but I have a way of phrasing it that I think is helpful, because you got to ask yourself, is the target purchase even strategically smart in the beginning? You know, why is this accounting recruitment company buying a healthcare provider? Yeah, I'm sure they explain it by they want to diversify, but what do they bring to that? Was there a synergy? Did it make sense? The second thing that I think you got to look at, and it's very hard to do when you're on the inside, but do the key stakeholders trust and maybe even like each other? You might say, well, that's not important. You know, you're buying a car, you don't care about the guy who's selling it to you. It's not the same. And I'm constantly saying this to people. When you sell your business with a 2 or 3 year earnout, it's like, okay, it's a bit dramatic. It's like a marriage. It's not going to work unless there is some level of trust. And a lot of acquisitions are made with people trying to be a little bit smart and cunning on both sides. So I think that's important. The other thing is that the buyer needs to be honest with themselves about their ability to manage and resource the merge, right? Because that's often the reason the promises that they make about how cool it's going to be afterwards can't be delivered on. But the big word I want to use here is the word misalignment. The reason these things work out is a misalignment, okay? And Simon, this is sort of what maybe not many people would agree with me on, or maybe they haven't thought about it. The whole concept of an earnout, which you know is included in most recruitment deals, while it's on the one hand prudent and essential for the buyer, because you don't want to pay all this money and then find it falls in a heap, it's also fraught with complexity, because by definition the vendor has a short or shortish term view and the buyer has a long term view, and that's where misalignment comes. For example, a buyer having bought a recruitment company, after say a year, say the earnout's 2 years, not uncommon, after 6 months, let's say, or a year, they want to change the brand, because that gives them leverage across their businesses, and there's a clear marketing strategy, and we're all one boat together, right? But the seller can only see possible market confusion and loss of clients, and that's going to affect their earnout. So there's a conflict right there. Systems, another one. The buyer wants to tackle the pain of merging the databases so they can get one vision of their business. There's one version of the truth. We can manage cleanly. We've got insights and visibility. The seller wants the status quo because they've been using their database and ATS for years, and they don't want to rock the boat or distress their consulting team, because that's going to affect their earnout. So this misalignment, there's sometimes a strategic misalignment. And I know this is really obvious, but most earnouts are based on profit, right? So the seller wants increased profits, like you did, but unfortunately the Lehman Brothers screwed that up. The seller wants increased profits because they're going to get a multiple on that profit in earnout 1 and 2, or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's 3 years. And you can increase your profit, Simon, you know this better than anybody, by cutting your spending and letting staff go. Now, the buyer also wants profits, but mostly they want growth and market penetration. They don't want to shrink. They don't want to buy a business and find the owner cutting staff to increase the profits, and they end up with, you don't shrink to greatness, right? So there's many causes of misalignment. The role of the vendor, I mean, these things, believe it or not, are often not discussed. The vendor sells, but still thinks she is going to be the boss. The buyer buys and thinks the vendor is going to go and do admin because they've got other people, for example. Performance expectation, commission structures. The amount of times a buyer has come in and within months changed the commission structure of the seller's business. What's going to piss off a consultant more other than having their commission structure changed? Cultural conflicts is a big misalignment, and people don't talk about it. But here's a recruitment company who like to celebrate success with putting big billers on a pedestal and big alcoholic nights out, and the seller is a completely more subdued style. So I think before we talk about how to mitigate, we need to understand that those things and many others, but we've got a limited time. Those are, in my mind, the classic misalignments that lead to a lot of pain, fallout, distrust, and loss of revenue.
So, Greg, doesn't that really boil down to essentially like figuring out what does good look like post-merger? Like really sitting down there and having these honest and open discussions about what is going to happen to the compensation scheme? What is going to happen to the applicant tracking system? What is going to happen in terms of who's going to be managing and leading the business? What are the synergies really going to be? And I'll give you an example of that. And it's a personal one. And I don't think it was any fault of Recruit Holdings, but essentially a big part of the M&A work that we did across Asia was based on the premise that we would continue to expand that M&A into the Americas and into Europe. We would buy search firms. We'd be in New York. We'd buy London. And there'd be a lot of positive synergies and client referrals coming from these major markets in financing and other areas. And that didn't ultimately happen for the businesses that we acquired in India and China and Southeast Asia. What happened was, Recruit pivoted. They jumped down a HR tech rabbit hole. They bought Indeed.com. They bought Glassdoor. They went down that. So there was no more global acquisition in terms of permanent recruitment outside of a little bit that came along with some staffing businesses where you are with People Bank and Shannon McLeod. So some things can be kind of, unforeseen in a way, but I do think that is super, super important beyond the numbers to sit down and the founders and the buyers, the key reps. What does good look like? What does good look like for you, and what does good look like for us to tackle these issues up front?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, actually. I made a note for this chat. I said that typically I find that some people, when they go into this, they either say in their head or they even say it out loud, we will sort this out post-deal. And that is the problem, right? Both parties, I think, use the word honest. And I don't think very, very often people buy businesses and they are devious. But it's sort of like I'm selling my house, so I better not let them see the hole in the garden or something. You should see the hole in the garden, and let's discuss how we're going to fix it before we buy the house. Because unlike the house, I'm really slaughtering my metaphors here. Unlike the house, when I sell a house, I'm gone. But when I sell my business, I'm not gone. I'm there for years in some cases. So I think there needs to be mitigation work by both parties. And often we think that the buyer does the due diligence, and in a legal sense they do. But the seller must also do their due diligence by asking all the questions and getting agreement on those points that you raise. What will my job be afterwards? Do you have a plan to let go any of the team? Are you going to, the commission structures, the brand? The amount of times people have screwed up acquisitions by forcing through a brand change, which is obviously very sensitive to the seller, both emotionally but also commercially. And so we shouldn't avoid any tricky questions. I think the biggest thing that's going to, I think some people think, let's not ask this question because it might stymie the deal. That's the wrong thinking. Ask the question so that it can be dealt with. And if it stymies the deal, that's good because you've done that before you paid the money rather than afterwards. So all those things need to be discussed in detail.
In terms of due diligence, I think this is a critical area. And I think you can overly trust. So I'll give you an example. There's a business I know in Hong Kong run by a very successful female entrepreneur. she acquired a financial services business, a really, really good one, top end retained search, fantastic work, always high profile for the work they do in the financial services space. And she believed the seller's story about pipeline, about deals in progress, about retainers that were being pitched, that were ongoing, and the money that was going to come through it. What actually happened post-deal, and she paid a lot of money for it, was that half of the pipeline didn't transpire for whatever reasons. So she overpaid, and it's taken her a decade or so to get that business back on track and make it right again. So I think there is an element of you can overly trust as well, and you really need to dig in very, very deep. I think often buyers, they look at the founders and they judge a business based on that. The business might have 10 people, it might have 1,000 people underneath, but they don't really go down to the very core level and understand the DNA of the business. You mentioned the DNA around Christmas parties and entertainment and how that will be affected post-deal, right? I think it's so important to have these very, very transparent conversations. And when you smell something, when your gut is telling you that there is something I should push harder on, exactly to your point, even if it derails the deal, if it's a question that has to be asked, that's in your mind, that is your opportunity to ask it. Because if you don't post-deal, it's almost too late, isn't it?
Definitely too late. I mean, what you're saying is exactly right. So a couple of points I'd like to just enlarge on. You talk about the cultural side of it. A lot of owners, and I may have been one actually, when I was even stupider than I am now, would have perhaps diminished the role of cultural differences and say, "Oh, look, that's all fine. We're all grown-ups. We'll get on." But let's take the example of a hard partying, build up the profile of the big billers, all the reward nights are drunken, versus a different style of company. And I'm not making value judgments. It is almost impossible to get those things to merge post-deal. The other thing you said about due diligence, often due diligence is done by finance people, and you've got to do the finance to make sure that we've really got those clients and what are the debtors and all that. But that's kind of the easy part of due diligence, actually. The more difficult part is things like this. The company's, it's a small deal, let's say. It's got 12 recruiters, and they bill, I'm going to make it up, 6-7 million a year. And that sounds good. But did you dig into the fact that 80% or 60%, 70% of the gross profit comes from just 3 people? And that there's actually 9 who are either very modest, mediocre, or worse. That completely changes the risk profile of that deal. Or another one, you've got a lot of recruiters and they all seem to be billing very, very well, but you didn't do your due diligence, which if you had done, you would have found out that they are transactors and that all the sales relationships are held by the owners. So the owners have got all the sales relationships, but you're looking at, I've got 15 recruiters who bill here, but they don't have any client relationships. Those are just 2 examples of the sorts of due diligence that we should, or 3 if you include the cultural one, that we should really dig into, because they are things that are, sometimes people think that's not that important. It's still a $6 million company. A $6 million company where half the billions are coming from 3 people can disintegrate to nothing.
You talked early on in the podcast about buyer risk in terms of client concentration with this business in Australia with the one principal government client, and it's exactly the same in recruiting. It's concentration of revenue in the hands of too few billers. And as you say, in a smaller business particularly, if those people leave, if they're not incentivized post-deal, then the buyer's not left with very much. And it can be even worse if cross-culturally there is no real alignment and understanding that 1 + 1 does equal 3. Yeah. So can you think of anything else that we, from putting a buyer's cap on, the buyers in this market, I know are from personal experience, I can see that they're being far more wary when they're making offers. And I've had a couple of experiences recently where, there's in this market, you mentioned headwinds, but I'm experiencing firsthand buyer reluctance to overpay, certainly, and not pay anything probably close to what the seller is expecting. Because a couple of deals I've been working on recently, they're not dead in the water, but they're kind of being postponed, and we're having ongoing conversations. Quite large deals, one in your neck of the woods, one with a UK-US operation. Essentially, the sellers are looking very much at what they did in 2022, which for most recruitment companies was a good year. You know, they had good top line, they had good profits. 2023 is off. It's off those numbers. And so the buyer, quite rightly, I think to a certain extent, is saying, well, we're judging you based on where you are right now and where the business is going to be. And, you know, they're also figuring in market headwinds, and I think they're becoming a lot more canny and a lot more sensitive to some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of really digging into maybe through mistakes in the past, or just maybe a cautiousness to get deals over the line. They are becoming a lot more sensitive to these issues that you raised in terms of red flags for buyers when they buy businesses. So that's a trend that I'm seeing. They're being a lot more smart about it.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a note. I'd like to come back to the due diligence checklist again, but picking up your point, I completely agree with you. So what I'm seeing is, and I don't spend my days thinking about mergers and acquisitions, but it's parallel to a lot of what I'm doing. I think it's true to say that there hasn't been a seller of a recruitment company who didn't think that their business was worth more than it's actually worth. So start there. Plus, they've got inflated aspirations because of some of the press they've seen about high multiples being paid over the last 2 or 3 years. But the buyers,
yes,
many of whom have been around the trenches a few times, are smelling a downturn. And so what I've seen is the seller talking about their 2022 results, their 23 results up till June, because that's the financial year here. And the buyer saying that your current results are trending down. What we need to do is do an average of this year and your budget for next year. And the seller saying, well, I'm not going to do that. And then the buyer's saying, okay, well, then we need a 2-year earnout because we want to see the reality of this. So there is definitely deals that are slowing. I think for sellers, it's like they had in their mind a dollar amount. That's probably not attainable now. So for the seller, it's a choice. I take less than I've been dreaming about, or I might have to wait to go right through the cycle and come out the other side. Now, that I've been telling people that I can't predict the future, but it might be a couple of years before you get back to the profits you made in 2022. So I think that's very much the flavor. I think buyers of recruitment companies are generally smarter, can't think of a better word, than they have been in the past. There've been some, a lot of deals are driven by ego and hubris, or were. I don't think you see it now. Like, we've got to grow revenue, and we've got to put the announcement out, and it's going to affect our share price, and I'm the leader who's driving all this growth. And then, a year later, it crumbles because it's a house of cards. So I think we're not seeing as much of that. People are much more careful. Just going back to the due diligence thing, I think a buyer would want to be absolutely drilling into revenue mix. How much of this revenue is permanent? How much of it is temp and contract? And any other style of revenue that there might be. Then on consultant billings and how that's distributed. And then on customer distribution. You don't want customers with more than 10% of your gross profit, like happened with that, 100% of your profit from the other deal that we heard about. You want, and then who holds the relationships is critical. And then margin, right? Sometimes a business looks reasonably profitable. But when you dig into it, you find there's a lot of low margin business being supported by a small amount of high margin business. You buy that business, you lose the high margin business, and you're stuck with this bloody low margin transactional, business that you can't make money out of. And of course, people say we've got the job adder database, and that's good. Job adder is a good database. But do the people use it? what data's in there? Can we extract from it? Because there's one thing having the technology, the real value is in do people use it? And how do we extract data so for example, if you buy a business and you want to cross-sell to your other businesses, you need to have access to the data. You can't rely on consultant goodwill for that to happen. And people do that. So I guess, I know I'm on a little bit of a riff and a rant, but for anyone listening to this who's thinking of buying a recruitment company, if you think you're going to get all your due diligence provided to you by an accountant, unless they're an accountant who specializes in recruitment and know what I'm talking about, which is very unlikely, you'll certainly know that the P&L is correct, but you won't be able to look under the covers and know what you really buy. And that is where the pain comes later on.
Greg, I'm really, really grateful that you just shared that list, the due diligence list. And that was actually one of the reasons why I set up Recruitment Transactions, because, I think I'm coming at it more from a perspective of someone who's been involved in building businesses and selling businesses and buying businesses. And what you talked about in my world is like the constituents of value. And so a lot of the work I'm doing these days is working with sellers to understand exactly the points that you made, that this is what buyers should be looking for. And this is how you need to improve your business to make you more saleable. So in other words, concentration risk, too much revenue in the hands of too few clients, too much revenue in the hands of too few consultants, not a good mix. You're all perm. You don't have any contract, any interim, any RPO in there. You're not making your, cash flows not being managed well. You're not using the systems as well as they can be. Like, these are things that smart and intelligent buyers should look for. So thank you for raising that. We'll get a list out to everyone after the podcast. But I wanted to, if you don't mind, there's a couple of things I wanted to do before we finish today. And I wanted to ask you about earnouts, actually, because it's something which is on my mind right now. Because I think, in a sense, when mergers happen, there is this unrealistic expectation from both the buy side and the sell side that numbers will continue to rise and grow. But we all know that during the integration process, a lot of time is going to be taken away. Like, the founders are going to be dragged into steering committees. They might be on planes getting to meet counterparts in other areas of the business. They might be looking at a new applicant tracking system. They might be being introduced to new clients. They'll be dealing with questions from their own people. They'll have money that they didn't have before, and they'll be thinking, what do I do with this and how do I use it? So there'll be a lot that's going on. And in my experience, it's not just a straight kind of increase in revenue and profits immediately from day one the M&A goes through. But the earnouts are often linked to that. So my question is, Greg, how many times have you seen in these deals where the earnouts are linked to a more realistic understanding that probably in year one at least, that revenues are not going to go through the roof. They're not going to be stratospheric. there's going to be some adjustment period, and therefore, the top line and the profit might not be as we might think it would be post deal. Like, are you seeing that at all? Because earnouts are really important, right? It's an important mechanism. And when I talk to sellers, they sometimes say, well, I can't really control all of the outcomes here because I'm not in charge as much as I would have been. And therefore, I don't want to over rely on a big earnout. I'd rather have more money up front. Like, what is your kind of view on how to get the best equilibrium in this scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer is, you don't see sophisticated, carefully thought out, fair earnouts as much as you should. Usually they just link to profit. And as I touched on earlier, it's dysfunctional because on the one hand, you're saying to the seller, your second payment or third payment will be linked to profit. On the other hand, you're saying to the seller, we wish to change your database, change your brand, and we'd like you to get your consultants to introduce all their clients to our finance division, but keep the same profit. So it's better, and I've seen a few like this, where the earnout is linked to profit and cooperation and other milestones. That is better.
Okay.
But it takes fair and reasonable behavior and attitude from both sides. So that's why very early on in this piece I said where there's some trust and even, synergy of personalities, it's going to go much better. if it's all financial and like dollar, 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 it's inevitably going to lead to, and I've seen it happen where the vendor says, I'm not helping on anything else. I'm doing my number. In fact, I'm billing right now myself. You want me to go to a committee meeting on, the strategy in the US? I'm not going. And you can hardly blame them when you say, I'm going to pay you a lot of money for hitting profit, but I want you to do these 19 other things that don't affect profit. That's why I said that there's a misalignment between short-term and long-term. So you don't see it often. I've seen it on the table more in recent years than in the past, where an earn-out profit figure is integral and important, but it's also like part of your earn-out will be that you have effectively helped us, and this was in a document, better worded than this, execute the change from ATS 1 to ATS 2. And that was part of the earn-out.
Love it. Yeah, no, I love it. I love it. I love it. Greg, before we finish, thank you. Some great gems that you've shared with us. Really, really appreciated. I wanted just to give our audience a bit of an understanding of some of the marketing materials that you have to help our industry. And I know you have several ways that you can support. So this is a plug for you, and congrats on winning the Rugby World Cup. But outside of that, this is also a chance for you to let us know what you have, and we'll put it up there for the world to see.
Yeah, look, I'm a complete fraud on the rugby, because if Australia had won, I'd be claiming that too. So I've got 2 horses in that race. Look, there's a lot of free things that people can access. I write a blog almost every week and have done for 13 years. So I'd ask people to subscribe to that at gregsavage.com.au. So that I think is useful. There's free ebooks you can download from there. If you like this podcast, if you search Greg Savage podcast, there are at least 50 that are easily available, including your one from before. So there's a lot of that sort of material, but I've also written 2 books, and you can get those off Amazon or from my website. That one, called The Savage Truth, is kind of semi-autobiographical, but it's basically the journey of the 3 or 4 companies I've built and the mistakes I made and the things we got right. And so it's quite useful for anyone in recruitment, but if you're trying to grow a recruitment business, which I imagine these listeners, then that would be a good book. This is called Recruit the Savage Way, and that's very recent. And this is basically everything I know about being a great recruiter. I was a kind of a good recruiter, but I was not great. In every company I worked in, there were a lot better recruiters than me, but I learned from them, and it's all in this book. So there's those 2 or 3 resources, and then there's my academy, which is video training that you would subscribe to, and that has surprised me with the uptake on that. It's about 100 hours of training for recruiters, sort of team leader style people, and also director level conference. There is this kind of material on that academy. So all of them can be got from our website, which is gregsavage.com.au. Thank you, Simon.
Brilliant. No, we'll put that out there. And having a name like Savage doesn't hurt, does it? When you come up with titles for books.
It's good for things like that. Not so good when you're a 11-year-old boy at boarding school and people want to bully you. So that was fun. but as a result, I'm not a very good guy to bully anymore, because I've dealt with it very well over the years.
Brilliant. Excellent. Well, look, thank you so much for joining us again. Really appreciate it, Greg. And hope to see you I'm in Tokyo today. I know you're in Sydney, but hope we can connect in person sometime in the new year. Wishing you and your family all the very best for the rest of this.
Thank you. Same to you. And I hope I can't see Japan on my agenda in the foreseeable future, but I love the place. I'd like to go back. But if you come down to Australia, make sure you give us a shout. We'll talk more.
We'll definitely do that. All right. Thank you so much, Greg. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Simon.